The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, joining us from Berlin, Germany. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, the date is finally set. The mystery is over. It has taken weeks and weeks and weeks for the Chinese to finally unveil that the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative will be celebrated at the Belt and Road Forum next week on October 17th and 18th in Beijing. Representatives from about 130 countries and more than 30 international organizations are going to be there. To say that this is a big deal this year is an understatement. Chinese President Xi Jinping himself will be giving the keynote address, and they've got a lot to talk about. I mean, there's been a lot of changes, Cobus, over the past 10 years since the beginning of the Belt and Road. And we know that in part because all week now leading up to the Belt and Road Forum, they've been releasing white papers and different, data sets and a real retrospective on what's happened over the past 10 years. Lots of competing narratives here coming out about the Belt and Road. The Chinese really trying to set a narrative that it's been a success and it's been productive. Meantime, a lot of folks in the West have a distinctly different point of view. You've been looking at some of the different reports coming out from both the Chinese and from our friends over at Boston University. What are they saying?
On the Chinese side, they released this massive white paper, it's like a billion pages long, that really gives you, kind of a real kind of rundown of the breadth of the Belt and Road Initiative and how huge it is. So, kind of that one is particularly, interesting if one is trying to kind of get your head around what it actually is and, how the financial integration overlaps with the trade integration, overlaps with the infrastructure and so on. Of course, the one that came from the Chinese government isn't going to take down the Belt and Road Initiative. But it was interesting, the kind of hardcore analysis that came out of Boston University also actually didn't take down the Belt and Road Initiative. It was critical, certainly. It pointed out that in a lot of ways, it certainly increased debt. And, the fact that it fed into a set of circumstances that led to increasing debt distress in the Global South. It certainly wasn't the only factor. But, it did contribute in some ways. Some of the developments were not great for the environment, but they also show that they are getting a lot better for the environment over time, and that there has been very significant investments in green energy over the last while. What I think is really interesting from the Boston University account is to show that in lots of ways, the Belt and Road Initiative really increased Global South countries' options. China lent an equivalent of additional World Bank, a little bit less, like 83% of the World Bank's kind of lending from 2008 to 2021. So an entire additional World Bank was basically added to the options of Global South countries, and Belt and Road Initiative projects, problematic as many of them were, actually did boost development in lots of cases. And so it's very much a mixed bag, but the kind of, voices that you're hearing sometimes from Western journalists are like, oh, the Belt and Road is over, and also it was a failure. Neither of those two are true. It's a complicated situation, but I think in a lot of ways the Belt and Road was strikingly successful.
Cobus, as you pointed out, one of the hallmarks of the Belt and Road was the fact that it was providing financing when others weren't. Lots of financing. And in fact, one of the reasons that 130 representatives are going to be going there, or from 130 different states, is because I think there's still a hope that China is going to have its big checkbook out and still going to start writing those checks again. One president that has those aspirations is Kenyan President William Ruto, who said he is going to be heading to Beijing next week with a wish list of about $1 billion for China to finance road construction, to finish a lot of the incomplete road projects that are now a safety hazard and also causing real political damage for the president that makes it look like things aren't getting done. Now, the question is, will the Chinese fork over the big money? Unlikely, given, as we mentioned in our previous show, that in 2022, again, according to Boston University, The Chinese lent $922 million to the entire African continent, so it seems unlikely that they're going to turn around then and lend one country $1 billion, not to mention a country that is already in a early stage of debt distress, to say the least. So that is going to be one of the key things that we're going to be looking at. Now, there is a link between the infrastructure spending and China's popularity overseas. And let me bring you back to a conversation that we had last year with Joseph Asunka, who is the chief executive officer of Afrobarometer. And in case you're not familiar with Afrobarometer, they are by far the most credible and most reliable polling agency on the African continent. They do surveys every year across a number of key issues, and they do the benchmark survey on U.S.-China relations. I think they do it in 34 countries, and it's quite an impressive survey. But let me just, for purposes of our conversation today, linking this infrastructure spending and public opinion, let me just refresh everybody on what Joseph said last year in our discussion with him here on this show.
If China begins to pull off from the infrastructure side, I do think that is going to have a major impact on how people view China on the continent. And this is my expectation, that it is increasingly going to be the case that the influence of China on the continent is likely to diminish because of that.
And it's going to diminish from a very high rate of public opinion. According to Afrobarometer's 2019 to 2021 poll, 63% of Africans thought that China's economic and political influence was positive. That was marginally higher than even the United States, who came in at 60%. In their 2023 update, both the U.S. and China declined considerably, but they were more or less at par. We also saw similar results from the Ichikowitz Family Foundation that surveyed thousands of young people across Africa, and 76% of the 4,500 people that they surveyed across 15 countries named China as a foreign power with a positive influence in their lives, compared to just 72% for the U.S. Now, again, that was taken a couple of years ago. So let's think about what the linkage is in between Chinese public opinion, infrastructure, politics, and media. And that's why we're thrilled today to have an expert who's done some fascinating new research on this, on the situation in Zimbabwe. William Hautungimana is a visiting assistant professor of political science at Oklahoma State University in lovely Stillwater, Oklahoma. And he joins us on the line from the central United States. William, I got to say, this is the first time we've ever had anybody from Stillwater, Oklahoma, but we are so happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have you discuss a topic that relates to the article that came out on the Conversation magazine.
Yes, so that really caught my attention when you and your research partner, I want to make sure she gets proper credit, Haruka Nagao,
Indeed,
who's also an assistant professor of political science at Oklahoma State University. The title of the article was very compelling. You asked 1,000 people in Zimbabwe what they thought about the Chinese, and what did they tell you?
So we were trying to look at public opinion toward China and Chinese investment, particularly in Zimbabwe. And we pulled from a sample of, we had 1,000, and we asked questions with regards to political influence and economic influence. So our finding actually brings an issue of agency of African people to the fore, because we do see that, yes, media have an influence, so both Western and Chinese media, or you can say China-friendly media with regards to Zimbabwe state media. So we see that when people listen to China-friendly media or Chinese media, they have more positive attitudes. So this was survey experiments. That means that we had people who were given certain kind of information, which we call frames, and others who were giving a different kind of information to try and see if there were differences in their answers. So in that case, we did find out that Western media, which tends to be critical, as Cobus has just stated, you find that it has a negative impact on the view of China. And also Chinese media, as I've mentioned, has a positive. But the issue of agency actually comes in when you think about partisanship. It's not like all these media have an overbearing influence on African people. Actually, you find that there is, even though China has a close relationship with the state, you find that Zimbabweans are more critical. And I should say that our sample, yes, is skewed to the fact that we pool mostly urban residents, and 64% urban resident, and 94% are highly educated. So we do find that when it comes to the ruling party supporters, there is an influence, a negative influence of critical Western media. And when it comes to opposition party supporters, there is no huge change because they already have a critical view of the government. The government, obviously, that has a close relationship with China. So in that case, we can see that change is in relation to one's position to a certain issue with regard to China. Then what we also see when you look at political influence, when we ask people questions after the treatment about the political influence of China. So opposition party supporters, even incumbent party supporters, are less positive. So that means there is no much influence when it comes to political influence, because most of the China's investment has been economic. And I think when we talk about politics, we talk about, obviously, when you're in relation to China, we think about non-interference. And I think that might be explaining our result. But I think the very important issue to take away here is African people are as critical, and they are receptive to both positive and negative media framing. And I think that speaks to the issue of agency. And I think that's where all the narrative about neocolonization, even narratives that are more positive, as saying that China is helping Africa development, tend to not think of people's agency. And African people, as a diverse population, people don't have similar opinions. They are not the monolith in this case. Yeah. So you can think of having different views depending on what party they support. And I think that's an important point to state. Yeah.
So, for context, can you give us an idea of like what the kind of media landscape is like in Zimbabwe? Like, what kind of platforms do Chinese media appear on, and how is it actually? How does it reach Zimbabweans, and how does Western media reach Zimbabweans?
So most people access via internet. But the first, if you think about platform where they access China-related information, think of state media. State media positively portray China, and that's because of the strong relationship. If you think about Look East policy under the Mugabe regime, and if you go back to the colonial era, when you think about the revolution war against the Ian Smith government, so that relationship have grown, and it even grew after 2003 when sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe. So, and you can see that kind of favorability from the state because the state sees China on its side against sanctions from the West. And also you see Xinhua pretty much. You find also the Rhodesia Herald, not Rhodesia Herald, pretty much. I'll say Herald. that was the how it was called in the back, not Rhodesia Herald.
You're dating yourself there a little bit on that one.
Yeah, I hope the listeners don't crucify me for that. It's actually the Herald. So the Herald also have favorability. You might find pretty much a plagiarism when you read the People's Daily. And if you read Xinhua, which is another Chinese, if you read you might see a lot of plagiarism, or you kind of see similar stories told in similar ways, pretty much parroting. It's either the Chinese media parroting what the Zimbabwe government official are saying or president is saying, or the other way around. Then when you think about Western media, it's mostly accessed through the internet. You can think about the Daily, you can think about the Guardian, you can think about the BBC, and obviously you can think about news like Washington Post, CNN, all those. Most Zimbabweans access that online, and they can have information of China's maybe involvement in mining and what kind of environmental issues mining is causing. And that has an impact on people's view on China. And when you think about that, opposition party supporter and incumbent supporter, there's this thing you call confirmation bias. You think opposition supporters, since they have a position, they are more likely to be attracted to Western media that is more critical of China's involvement. And incumbent supporters will do the same, will be more likely to read or listen or view Chinese media that is available to them. And I think That's one thing we do in our research. We try actually and randomly select people and actually give them different treatment while considering their party positions. And that, I think, helps us to make a distinction of what opposition party supporters think versus what incumbent party supporters think.
So can you tell us a little bit about the mechanics of how you conducted the poll? You talked about that it was urban and well-educated. Zimbabwe is not an easy place to do those kinds of things. And so how did you do it online, by telephone? Did you have people on the ground? Give us a little bit about the methodology that you used.
So we did it online. You pretty much hire a survey-taking company. And obviously, I cannot say what company it is because I have to protect the respondents. So we pretty much pay a survey company. We design all the questions and we design the framing. And this survey company has respondents already, a pool of respondents in different parts of the world. And fortunately, they had a pool of respondents in Zimbabwe. So once the survey is deployed, they get to pretty much fill it. They are given a certain amount of time. It was not more than 10 minutes. And I think we had about 16 questions, I think, on different issues. And the framing is pretty much giving different media sources. You pretty much draw information from different media sources. Like I'll draw information from The Guardian, from the BBC, or from CNN, put it all together and kind of create a good frame, a very coherent story that is convincing. Then also collect some information from Xinhua. You can also People's Daily and also the Herald. You kind of create a frame that is coherent. And participants will read these frames. Our survey was designed. They are supposed to read the frames before they respond to the questions. And the questions, they also have to identify which party they support. So we had ZANU-PF, which are Zimbabwe African National Union, Patriotic Front. Then we had CCC.
And that's the ruling party. ZANU-PF is the ruling party.
Yeah, that's the ruling party. And we had the Citizen Coalition for Change, CCC, and we had the Movement for Democratic Change. So we had all those as parties that they could select for. Obviously, with the dominance of the ZANU-PF and CCC now, currently CCC has actually garnered a lot of support. So most respondents were from those two parties and less from MDC. So by identifying, that means we can now say we have identified a party affiliation and also see how they respond. Then we ran analysis based on how they responded to questions. And we saw that, yes, the frame does work in different ways because it depends on party affiliation. And also the frame influence also is dependent on one position, whether they are critical or less or more.
And you found that most were critical. Only 37%
yes.
of your respondents were positive towards China. That's a pretty low number. Were you surprised by that, or was that in line of what you expected?
Not very surprised, given the fact that when we looked at Afrobarometer and just subsetted the Zimbabwe samples, when you subset the Zimbabwe sample and kind of narrow it down and see, I think it's around 47. So if you consider that there might be margin of error in terms of sampling and all these it's not very surprising, given also the economic conditions in Zimbabwe, given China also mining companies, issues of labor, they are not working under good conditions. So you see their criticism. And if you are pulling from mostly educated people, you are most likely to find, I'm not trying to be very elitist in this case, but they'll be more critical. And most educated people actually tend to also support the opposition parties. So the numbers are not very surprising by looking at the sample. So if you ask a question, will it reflect the same thing if we look at the whole of Zimbabweans population? In that, you might see different numbers. But I think Afrobarometer then, in that case, might actually, because it's more nationally representative. But we don't see a huge difference because we actually see that it's around 47%.
So, Zimbabwe is special in some ways, in the sense that Over the last year or two, there's been this very polarizing political fight where a coalition of NGOs, particularly labor and environmental NGOs, as you mentioned, were essentially up against both the Chinese government, Chinese companies, and the Zimbabwean government, in complaining about the environmental and labor impacts of some of these projects. So can you talk a little bit about how that kind of polarization may have affected the poll results?
So if you look at the rhetoric before Chamisa was under the MDCT, that's before he left that and actually created...
I'm sorry, remind us who Chamisa is again?
Chamisa is the leader of the opposition parties. So CCC, this Citizen Coalition for Change. So he was very critical about Chinese involvement. He was even threatening to expel Chinese companies and businesses due to the mistreatment of workers. But that actually, I think, might have aided in creating this division, how one viewed China, because the opposition had to posture itself as a anti-China and looking at China as a force that is supporting authoritarian resilience, meaning keeping the current government in power. So the rhetoric was more channeled towards saying China is actually aiding the ruling party and actually allowing it to continue not providing public goods that the population need. But that rhetoric changed. I don't know if you saw leading to the recent election. I think he went silent a little bit on a push against China and pointing to Chinese company malpractices in Zimbabwe. So I think initially the rhetoric from the opposition might have created the polarization that you're talking about, pretty much making a division like pro and anti-China, and that demarcating the opposition and the incumbent parties kind of divisions. Yeah.
I guess I'm surprised a little bit that the number is as low as it was, only because the Chinese will tell you, and again, together with ZANU-PF, they push back against the Western media narratives, and they also push back specifically against the United States and some of the rhetoric that comes out of Washington by saying that the Chinese are the country's largest investor. They have built out parts of the Hwanghae power station, so a lot of the energy that comes now into Zimbabwe is produced by Chinese-built power plants. They Sino Steel and Sino Mine are also very big. They're building a huge steel plant there. In fact, the largest in Africa that's employing thousands of people. They're the first country in Africa now to move up the battery metal supply chain by processing lithium. Zhejiang Cobalt has a huge plant that's there. And so in some respects, that the elites who oftentimes benefit from these mining deals, from the power, from the infrastructure that the Chinese are bringing, and a lot of the aid, I guess I am surprised that they're not, more sensitive to the positive benefits of Chinese engagement, given the fact that China is a major, major player in Zimbabwe, in part because the West is absent altogether because of the sanctions for the most part. So I guess that surprised me a little bit.
Indeed. And I think that might explain why Chamisa's rhetoric against China kind of waned when building up to the recent elections. But when you think about political elite, you have to kind of look at them as, you can call them office seekers in a way. Their goal is to pretty much create an issue area, an issue they focus on that they think might resonate with people. When people see Chinese presence and what the elites are saying and they are pointing, for the public, when you talk about public opinion, you don't have to show evidence of you as a person who is knowledgeable, pretty much understand the dynamics, and also you understand the shortfalls and the positives of China's involvement. But it's how one projects China to an audience that is willing to listen or trust the person. That's what influences public opinion. And I think one thing we are trying to show in our study, we are trying to say Zimbabwe president might have positive views, and you might find the opposition party might project negative views. But we also see that it's not a black and white, that Zimbabweans are divided in that way, especially when you look at critical audience, mostly educated people. So in a way, we have to think of how do people respond, and how are the people who are experiencing and actually reading about the negative effect of China's responding, other than what the elites are saying. Political elites might use rhetoric and might sometimes abandon certain kind of rhetoric and adopt another because their goal is to actually gain power. And if you look at Chamisa's rhetoric, it's pretty much has changed. But when you think about other countries in Africa, for example, You see in Zambia, where Sata was very critical of China, then when he gained power, he switched his rhetoric, it became more friendly. So that explains how political elites might actually act. But if Chamisa, I don't like use hypothetical, but in this, just trying to highlight a point, I'll say, if Chamisa were to gain power and become the leader of Zimbabwe, the language might change because then the reality comes. I have to work with China, given that our country doesn't have very good relationship with the West. And I think you might see a strategic move, a more pragmatic way of looking at China. So elites and mostly political elites, especially when they are challenging for power, it's hard to see whether their position is going to be consistent over time.
So I wonder if I can ask you a media studies question. Where do you land, looking at your results, where do you land, along the continuum between two different conceptions of the power of media? On the one hand, that media, the different kind of media one, consumes does shape one's political positioning. And on the other hand, that one's political positioning fundamentally shapes how one consumes media and the way that you construct media in your own brain in order to then take the message that you kind of believe already. So where do you think your data falls along that continuum?
So I think you can look at it both ways, because whether what party you're affiliated with, whether the opposition party or the incumbent party, you have already a position. And the way you're going to be influenced by media will differ depending on what party you actually belong to. If it's critical media from the West, if you are the incumbent party supporters, you will think it to only have a negative impact only maybe on people who already had that opposition party supporter. But what you see that regardless of the position, media has a huge influence. Regardless of preconceived ideas, you actually see that critical media has an influence, and also positive media or favorable media from China has also positive influence. So you can look at it from both sides and say, we frame considering the fact that people have different views. That's why we're giving them different media frames. And depending on their positions, they are most likely to react to media in certain ways. It's not just assuming that the whole story of China involvement is positive, even though, yes, in some cases it's positive. So you try and capture how do people think when they read, when they consume, with regards to what their preconceived beliefs were. And I think in this case, you actually find that the media frame itself and how people consume it has an impact depending on their positions.
So when we talk about Chinese media in Africa, there is what we call above-the-line media and below-the-line media. And I think this is very important in the context of our conversation about Zimbabwe because both are present. The above-the-line media is that retail media that you see, the Xinhua, CGTN TV, China Radio International, China Daily Newspaper. These are the traditional media.
Yes.
And in many ways, there's a lot of evidence to suggest those aren't that effective, in part because in most African media markets, including Harare, there's a lot of competition for attention and time. And so they are not the most compelling media. The below-the-line media, this is where it gets interesting. And I think this is where your respondents are picking it up on. This is where these content sharing agreements, where Xinhua, for example, will go to the Chronicle or go to some of these big Zimbabwean news websites and say, you know what, we'll give you a free feed of Xinhua. And it just appears. It appears in their social feeds. It appears in the newspapers. Sometimes it's identified as Xinhua. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's rewritten by a local reporter, but the key themes, as you've pointed out, remain intact. So the messages remain intact. And Cobus, over the years, I've been quite dismissive of Chinese propaganda in Africa, in part because it's not very good. But maybe because it's not very good doesn't mean it's not effective. And I think William research here points out that it's money well spent. I mean, you can see the results. That if you're back in Beijing listening to this, you're like, if we didn't have the propaganda, we didn't have the media, our numbers would be even worse. So it really validates the expense that they've invested in Chinese state media in Africa. So in some respects, Cobus, this validates the need for state propaganda.
I suppose. I think in the case of both Western media and Chinese media, the question is less the particular or like the way I'm thinking about right now, is that, and I'm sure William is going to change that soon, is that, the question is to a certain extent less the particular message that's coming in this particular thing that you're reading, and rather the accumulation of concepts or accumulation of ways of seeing things that become a kind of a air that you breathe, ambient reality around you that just shapes how you see reality. William, could you get a sense of to which extent Chinese media is starting to play that role in some cases in Zimbabwe?
I think going back to Eric's point, saying that it's a lot of more pickup from the Chinese media than people literally reading Chinese media outlet. And I think we find that actually when we were trying and understand the frame and trying to design our research. So we're talking about to what extent I think Chinese media is influencing Zimbabwean. You can look at it also from the state media side. Pretty much state media is a dominant media, and Zimbabwe TV, and also obviously the Herald is one if you think about newspaper. So you see that, yes, when you look at maybe Afrobarometer is telling you the favorability, you are trying to say, where is it coming from? Partly you can say it's coming from the state media, and partly you can say people, if you're talking about the surrounding, what you're trying to talk about, the surrounding, are they seeing infrastructure? Are they seeing Confucius institutions around? To what extent do they interact with even Chinese businesses? So that it might not be all the Zimbabweans who have that kind of experience. But I think when we go back to what Eric was saying is when you come to propaganda, can we judge whether it's successful, Chinese propaganda? I think people are feeding from government rhetoric and also feeding from, when you're in a position where you look at, we have all these sanctions. They ask, where do these sanctions come from? And China position itself as an all-weather friends, how they call themselves, especially when you think about relationship between Zimbabwe and China. If you're a citizen, I think it kind of gives you the notion that China has a good role to play in Zimbabwe currently, given the economic issues they are facing. And China has been there from independence. The relationship strengthened after 2003 with loans, So I think if you look at the history, you understand that, especially when you're pulling a sample from educated Zimbabweans who are familiar with part of Chinese, you might see the results that we are seeing. So the political atmosphere, people's experience with regards to their economic status or economic situation, and also the media they are listening to, whether it's state media, whether it's reading about Chinese involvement from the Chinese media source or Zimbabweans local media source that have picked it up from Chinese media source. Yeah.
Now, the Zimbabwean government, ZANU-PF in particular, along with the Chinese embassy in Harare, are, let's just be honest, they're a sensitive bunch. They don't take criticism very well.
Yes, indeed.
And they've even come after us, for things that are very mild, by the way. I mean, we're not on the fire-breathing pro or anti-ZANU, pro or anti-China, none of that stuff. And we have attracted their attention from time to time over the years. So I'm curious, when you push this article out onto the conversation, and we're going to put a link to the article in the show notes for everybody to see, did you get any feedback? Did you get any hate online? Did you get any criticism from either the Chinese embassy or ZANU-PF or anybody? What was the reaction that you got?
I think Michael, Ota, and I were all thinking about that because we know how journalists are treated in Zimbabwe. We've read about it. No, we got a lot of readers. Currently, I think we have 43,000 readers who have read the article around the world. And honestly, we haven't got any comment.
Okay. I don't know if that's good or bad.
That's why. It's like, are we really not hitting a nerve or, that's not our goal. But because it kind of gives you a sense of, did I tell a story so well that I don't invite criticism or something?
Yeah. I mean, you want to provoke a little discussion here, right?
That's one thing. And I think it's also how we told the story. We somehow, if you really, we try to balance. There is criticism. There is also positive influence of China, and that's true. I think that's what Cobus was talking about. The complexity is not very simple to say China has a negative impact or a positive impact. We have to try and understand the nuances in the relationship between Africa and China. So I think we try to tell that story and say, look at what elites are claiming, what scholars are claiming China to be doing in Africa. Here's our opposing ideas. But the important thing we have to think about, there are people actually who are affected by China's involvement in Africa. And if we don't try and understand their perspective, therefore, we don't even know what it means to them, what China's involvement means to them, especially when governments claim to serve their people. I think the way we told the story might have actually somehow protected us from criticism, but it's just been a few weeks, so you never know.
Okay. Yeah, there's still time. There's still plenty of time. And let me just be very clear with you that we too have approached it the same way you did, and that did not protect us. You know, we've gotten our fair share of ire from the Chinese embassy in Zimbabwe over the years. So and again, for things that I think are surprisingly not controversial, but they're a very sensitive bunch. They're a very sensitive bunch. Cobus, let's get you to have the final question today.
So just for context, obviously Eric was quoting Afrobarometer studies before, and their studies were frequently asking the question about the popularity or their developmental role or other kind of like people's respondents, kind of views of China's involvement in their country in comparison frequently with other international actors like the United States, but also former colonial countries like UN agencies and so on. I was wondering whether, and I think your study was designed differently, but I was wondering whether you got any kind of inkling of how Western powers or other external actors rated or compared to Chinese popularity also, like, kind of among the different kind of respondents you spoke with.
I think what you're asking speaks to the introduction at the beginning of the conversation from Eric talking about when you look at the percentage. So we're looking at like how many percent of people think China's involvement is positive versus the US. There's no stark difference. It's not like very huge difference. And actually this speaks to studies done by Daniel Matengo, I think from Yale. He looks at China's favorability across the world, and he finds that, yes, most people still, the baseline is US when people think people have favorable views. But when you start exposing them to more information about China's involvement, there is an increase in favorability. So even though the baseline is still pro-West or US, there has been an increase. And I think you can attribute that increase, even in favorability toward China, to the involvement and also partly media. I think China has been involved in investing a lot in media, like Eric said. And when it comes to public opinion, even though when we start looking actually at the output and the outcome of China's involvement or US or Western involvement, when we look at public opinion, there's no huge difference. And I think that speaks to why Biden invited heads of states to try and re-strategize on how they approach their dealings with African countries, because China has been getting more progress in doing that. So it's a battle for public opinion. Right now, if you think about China media investment, and also you can get it when you read Western media, you find that critical kind of taste to their narrative about China.
The article is entitled, "We Asked 1,000 Zimbabweans What They Think of China's Influence on Their Country. Only 37% viewed it favorably," written by William Hautungimana and his colleague Haruka Nagao, both assistant professors of political science at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I still think it's fantastic that we have a guest from Stillwater, Oklahoma. Population 48,000. Place that very few people go to.
You looked that up.
I did. I've never heard of Stillwater, Oklahoma. So, I mean, Cobus, the places we have gone with this podcast is really just quite remarkable. And so, but William, thank you. And also to Haruka for the great work that you guys have done on this. It's under peer review. Is that correct? You're trying to publish this as a bigger article, correct?
Indeed. And I think we have gotten good reviews. I think if we were to pretty much address issues that they raised, I think we have a good chance of publication. And to just add something, it's a bigger project. We are putting together a book proposal looking at public opinion toward China's involvement in Africa. We have another paper that we have sent out, which looks at opposition party supporters and their attitude toward China. And especially when China works, when it's more likely to have a strong relationship with the incumbent party. So we look at that, we actually find that the critical view of China pretty comes from the relationship with the incumbent party in some countries around Africa, because people think that the government is corrupt, or people who don't trust the president all somehow have negative attitudes toward Chinese involvement. So once that book is written, I'm sure you're going to see it. It's still in the works.
Yes, we do. And we would love to have both of you back when the book is written and when the article comes out, just to hear more about the great research that you guys are doing. William, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us to talk about your great work in Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Cobus, an absolutely fascinating piece of research from William, and I'm really excited to see the longer paper because I'd love to delve into why that number was, in my view, lower than expected. Again, I would have expected the number to be significantly higher, maybe 45, 50% rather than 37%, only because, again, the Chinese are really, they're the only major power that's active in Zimbabwe given the sanctions. And speaking of the sanctions, I think it's worth mentioning how ridiculous these sanctions are. Why is it that the United States is punishing Zimbabwe? And forget about the human rights and forget about all that other stuff. And here's the reason why. Because they don't do the same to Vietnam. They don't do the same to Saudi Arabia. They don't do the same to Egypt. And again, for some reason, Vietnam is different than Zimbabwe. And yet Vietnam is as complex a place as Zimbabwe is politically. So again, that's why I would have thought that the numbers for the Chinese would have been higher under the circumstances. And so that took me by surprise.
I read that because the survey focused on people, a lot of them with college degrees and kind of in cities. So that self-selects for the kind of middle class or upper middle class, in Zimbabwean society. And to that extent, I guess, for me, it became a kind of a snapshot of what that kind of like group of people thinks about the government, particularly because the Zimbabwean government is so closely aligned with China. I took it that some of the issues around Chinese involvement, particularly the labor environmental issues, in Chinese mining, which is very prominent in the Zimbabwean economy, is kind of being filtered through larger kind of issues. I think, like, one frequently sees that middle class people tend to sometimes be the kind of sharp point of resistance against government because they have a little bit of the means to be able to have enough kind of mental space to think about whether they resent the government or not instead of trying to just survive. And that seemed to me like an issue kind of at play here. So yeah, but as you say, like the sanctions issue, I think is really, I mean, not to diminish the human rights problems in Zimbabwe that are very significant, but at the same time, African countries with horrendous human rights records are being courted by the United States and the UK all the time. And
yeah, I mean, like in Washington and New York, the leadership of Equatorial Guinea gets treated like royalty. And it's like, how is that possible?
At the same time, the sanctioning of Zimbabwe is essentially holding the entire southern African subcontinent back. Kind of the entire subcontinent is being affected by the sanctioning of Zimbabwe. And it has had a kind of a long-term impact on a lot of economic, kind of outcomes for a lot of other countries in this region. So yeah, it's problematic. And of course, what the sanctions end up doing, as they frequently do, is they end up actually strengthening the hand of the government that they're supposed to be punishing, because it just weakens all other opposition. It gives the government the perfect excuse to punish everyone they want. This sanctions essentially creates a perfect kind of screen to hide behind. And it also strengthens the hand of China, kind of because they're the only game in town. So, if strengthening China and weakening opposition in Zimbabwe was the aim of the sanctions, then great, they succeeded.
And that is precisely what we've seen for more than a half a century in Cuba as well. So let's quickly move on. I just want to get your take before we go, because it has been a dramatic past 5 or 6 days in the world with the eruption of war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And let's think about this in the China-Africa context. And you and I were talking about this just before we started the show, how I think this war in many ways is going to be the best thing that's happened to China in Africa for at least 4 or 5 years, because the oxygen in Washington now has been just sucked out of the room to focus on Russia and the Middle East now. And this is the same dynamic that we saw after 9/11 and for much of the 2000s leading up to really the Biden administration, where they said we're going to pivot back to Africa. Remember, Biden said, what's the famous words? We're all in, okay? Now, we're all in when we're not confronting conflict in the Middle East and Russia, and then to some extent even out here in Southeast Asia in the South China Sea as well. So my take on this is that the United States effort for Africa just went poof this weekend. Biden is not going to go to Africa this year. That was one of the anticipated outcomes of last December's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And in many ways, if we look at the rise of China and Africa in the early 2000s that led to where we are today, it was because there was no engagement from the United States and Europe because they were focused elsewhere. Well, here we are again, and the United States and Europe are once again focused elsewhere. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult for African countries to get the kind of attention and engagement that they so desperately want and need from other partners outside of China. But at the end of the day, China may be the only game in town. And we will find out after the Belt and Road Forum, will China be the kind of partner that Africa is counting on? Because we don't know if they're going to start spending again the way they did 10, 15 years ago. Highly unlikely. So a new dynamic is about to enter into the China-Africa relationship, one where they might have some more room to maneuver, but one without as much cash.
Yeah, I mean, you packed a lot of things, different kind of points in there. In the first place, just in relation to the conflict, one just has to say, like, the absolute horror of the attacks on civilians, the blockading and then bombing of Gaza, but at the same time, these like horrifying like attacks from Hamas is absolutely horrifying in all directions. It's such a like omni nightmare, it's really like shocking and appalling. In relation to China, yeah, I tend to agree with you that in the first place, it certainly draws away attention from the US about China. Like particularly as we see, like less than a week ago, the South China Sea was the biggest story, in the news. Now it's barely getting any attention.
Not in our world, it's not, but everybody else I see.
Yeah, no, in our world, certainly it remains a hot issue. But, kind of like the New York Times is not sending a correspondent over to the South China Sea soon. Kind of they are focusing on Israel. And it gives you this kind of weird, like I was speaking to an African think tank expert this week, and he was joking that, kind of you see, like suddenly you see African countries mostly talking just about debt and reforming the World Bank. And suddenly it gives you this weird feeling like, oh, we're back in the 1980s. And this also gives me that feeling. It's like, oh, suddenly it's all Russia, all Middle East. We're back in the 1980s. And, what China was doing in the 1980s was quietly expanding its development and quietly expanding its influence, and particularly in the 1990s and onwards, in places like Africa. And that is probably what we're going to see now, like around, as you say, the Belt and Road Forum. And of course, the Belt and Road Forum is going to be gearing up. It's going to be the first kind of ground being laid for FOCAC next year, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So, like I agree with you that I don't think we're definitely not seeing a return to the kind of model of policy bank-led lending that made China a star in Africa in, kind of for the last 20 years. That definitely doesn't mean that there's not going to be any money flowing from China to Africa. I think what we're seeing is the development of a set of new models of engagement, including a much more robust kind of role for Chinese companies and a different kind of blended finance models and a different set of engagements coming from the Chinese state. So what those are going to be, we don't know. But like this week, we were covering this really startling story about more than 13 billion proposal for essentially a full overhaul of the South African logistics and mining sector proposed to the South African government by China Communications Construction Company. So, what that's going to be, we have no idea. But the emerging role of Chinese companies in the African kind of energy infrastructure kind of sector, transport and green energy particularly, is significant, I think. And I think we're only seeing the first inkling of what that could be. It could be very, very interesting to see it emerging over the next few years.
Well, the other thing that went up in smoke on Saturday when Hamas launched their surprise attack on southern Israel is the IMEC. That's the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Did I get that right?
Yes.
IMEC. Okay, this is the latest Belt and Road killer. Okay, so I think that Xi Jinping can go into the Belt and Road Forum with a little bit of a snark in his smile there, like, bring it on. You want to take us on? Do it. There is no way on God's green earth now that you're going to run a trade corridor through Israel, right? I mean, this just never going to happen. Never going to happen.
Well, not soon anyway, yeah.
I mean, but okay. I mean, if it happens in 20 years, who cares? But this is not going to happen in any short-term horizon that's going to compete with the Belt and Road. And that's ostensibly what it's there for. So I think the Chinese can rest very, very comfortably thinking that any effort by the United States, so we got B3W, PGII, and IMEC now that are just, yeah, whatever. I mean, none of that's going to happen. I mean, the politics aren't there, and the politics were never there. And now we've got war in the Middle East. Again, that's threatening a lot of the stability of these supply chains. And so it's hard to imagine that that's ever going to come to fruition, especially if it's private sector driven, which is a lot of what the United States wants to do. The private sector is very risk averse now from investing in these parts of the world. So I think IMEC, put it on the pile of acronyms. Okay, we should celebrate this. You know, every time we say the words Blue Dot Network, it's a drinking game, B3W, PGII. The list is enormous and nothing comes of it. Nothing comes of it. I mean, that's what's just so crazy is they keep inventing these acronyms and these new programs and they don't deliver on any of it. So I think IMEC, pour a 40 over it, as they say in the old, I mean, it's done. It's done. So anyway, it's a lot going on. Very interesting. We're going to be covering all of these topics over on our Global South podcast, which those of you who get the Africa feed, you get all those. If you are interested in these topics as obsessive as we are about it, go over to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe and you can sign up for a 30-day free trial of the newsletter. You get all the podcast transcripts. You get our chat bot. You get so many cool things. And we've got new research that's going to be coming down the line. We've got some new battery metal data sets that are coming, and we're going to put a whole bunch of analysis for our subscribers only coming out of Indonesia, and also updates on our cobalt data set that's going to be coming out in January as well that Géraud is working on right now. So some amazing things. We've got a fantastic team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And again, unlike so many of the other China-focused websites, our team all live in the Global South. We're not sitting in New York. We're not sitting in Washington. We're not in London. We're here on the ground talking to people. And you can see that over on our YouTube channel where you're seeing Antonia, our Southeast Asia editor, taking the Whoosh train, the new high-speed rail built by the Chinese, or Njenga, our climate editor in Nairobi, at a China trade festival. So you see all these things that we're actually on the ground, and that's what differentiates us from everybody else. Other people, they'll vacation in the Global South. They'll do a story here and a story there, or they've got a freelancer who does a couple different stories. Literally, this is all we're doing 15, 16 hours a day with this fantastic team. And it requires your support. And we want to stay independent. We want to stay feisty. And that depends on those wonderful subscriptions and also our Patreon supporters as well, who we're so grateful for. Cobus and I will be back again next week for another edition of the show. So for Cobus van Staden in Berlin, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.